South Ocean Point Christian Church. Let's worship together. He's coming on the clouds. Kings and kingdoms will bow down. And every chain will break as broken hearts declare his praise. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sin of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Oh, every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. So open up the gates, make way before the King of Kings. Our God who goes to save is here to set the captives free. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah, roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sin of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Oh, every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Sing, who can stop? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? 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 Yeah, who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sin of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Oh, every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb.
Hi, welcome to Equality Park. Many of you know where that is. It's right here in Newport. And there's a reason why we're starting this series, this new series that we're doing in the symbolic location called Equality Park. And I guess the best way to introduce it to you is to tell you what I'm really sad about lately. 2020 has been a real bummer for me, as it has been for many of you. And what has caused me to be bummed out or saddened is not so much just because of the crisis of COVID or anything like that, but what it has revealed about the weaknesses of our society and our nation. and especially the community of the church. I'm sure you've all heard the saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. But there's another part of that saying, and that's the weak get going out of here. And I feel like crisis revealed for us the deep divisions in our society. These divisions are about our differences. And I guess I never realized how different we are from each other, how polarized we are, and how these differences have eroded the ideals that we all strive for as Americans and as Christians. And that's the ideal of equality. So the series that we're going to talk about in the next 4 sessions is a series about difference. We're going to entitle this series Different Together. And if that sounds oxymoronic to you, it should, because that's what we're going to talk about. The question we have to raise for ourselves is, why have our differences divided us? Why have our differences eroded the ideal of equality? And this first session, we're going to talk about the theoretical foundations of that. In other words, we're going to talk about how Christians navigate difference, and how that difference in Christianity is actually a source of equality and not the cause of conflict, when coupled with what it is to be Christ-like, loving. And so that's what we'll start off with. And then what we're going to do is look at the various important differences in our community and how these differences make a difference in what it is to be a Christian, how they're important and not sources of conflict when approached correctly, from the correct value system. Now, we might say that actually difference and equality, naturally speaking, should be in conflict with each other. The words are opposite of each other. To be different is to be unequal. And thus, the famous 19th century philosopher Nietzsche argued that equality is an oxymoron when we apply it to humans. That there's no good reason to say that we are equal in value, because that's what we want when we talk about equality. We don't mean that we're equally tall, we're equally physical, we're equally strong. We don't mean any of that. What we mean is that each and every one of us, despite all our differences, are equally important, equally to be respected, equally valued. But the question Nietzsche asks us from a purely natural point of view is, what's the rational basis for that? The traditional answer is what makes humans different, right? Because we're obviously not saying that humans are equal to cockroaches. We're obviously not saying that humans are equally valuable as llamas. No, we're rather saying that humans among each other, all of us as humans, deserve to be treated with equal consideration and with equal respect. But Nietzsche asks, well, what is it about us then as humans that makes us valuable, that thus distinguishes us from the cockroach and the llama? We might say, well, we're rational, right? We're rational beings. But that's true, but rationality is something we don't have to an equal degree, do we? So if we're going to use rationality as what makes us valuable, then we're not equal, because all of us are different with regard to how much rationality we possess, how much intellectual potential we possess. And so it can't be that. It can't be strength or physical. And in fact, if you look at any talent, anything that might serve as the basis for what makes us valuable among humans, you're going to find that either many humans don't have it, or we all possess it to different degrees. So not purely naturally speaking, this idea of equality seems to be a myth, doesn't it? So thus, where did we get this idea from? Where did we get the idea that we are equal in value? And Nietzsche is very precise and honest about where it comes from. He says it comes from the Christian value system. And that once that value system has eroded or been abandoned, then the whole rational basis for equality makes no sense. So what we want to do then is look at the Christian value system, look at the biblical perspective, and ask ourselves, what is it about Christianity and Judaism that forms the rational basis for our equality? And what we're going to find is very interesting, something that's going to seem paradoxical, that what makes us equal is not what we share in common, not what we have an equal amount of, but actually what makes us different. That actually it's difference that makes the difference with equality. So let's start with the central value of Christianity, the central command. We see in Matthew chapter 22 that Jesus talks about what the first and most important command is, and that is the command to love God and love your neighbor. Now, what's interesting about that passage is that Jesus says, you love God, and then he says the second command, love your neighbor, is just like it. And that word like in the Greek, homoios, literally means equivalent. It's used by Euclid, those of you who remember geometry, it's used by Euclid to talk about what are called congruent shapes. Congruent shapes are shapes that have all the same characteristics, but are different in size or different in proportion. And so what applies to one shape will apply to every other shape that's congruent to it. So Jesus is actually telling us that the command to love God is just like loving your neighbor. To love your neighbor, to love your fellow human being, is actually just like loving God. Now, why would that be the case? Why would loving my neighbor actually be equivalent to loving God? Why would valuing God, loving God, be equivalent to loving and valuing my neighbor? Well, it all is about what it is about humans that make them like God, and that is the image of God. We read in the very beginning of the scripture, Genesis chapter 1, that God created human beings in a way that's different than every other created thing that he made. We are the image of God. Now again, you might ask this question, well, if we're the image of God, but we're so different from each other, how is it that we then are to be treated equal? What is it about us that we have in common that makes us all equally the image and therefore equally valuable, equally lovable? Well, let's take a close look at those passages in Genesis. When we understand what the image of God actually is, we're going to see that it forms the basis for equality and difference. So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Here we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness.'" Now you notice something here, that it doesn't say, "Let me make man in my image according to my likeness." Instead, it uses the we, the plural. Okay? Pay attention to that. Let's read on. "And let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Then it tells us that God actually does it. And it says, God, singular, created man in his singular own image. So we see something about God here, don't we? We see that God is first described in the plural, and then God is described in the singular. It says something very important about God, doesn't it? What Christians get out of this is the first mention or the first intimation of the Trinity. That God is actually an absolute one, but also a many in one. So then he creates human beings. And if he's going to create him in his image, then we're going to see this similar many in one idea. So in verse 27, it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, singular. Human being, singular. Male and female, he created them, plural. So if you were reading in the Hebrew here, you'll find that actually we have human being as singular. He creates this singular thing, and then it expands and says this singular thing is really a plural thing, is really a many. So what we find here is that the image of God is actually not a singular thing. It's not that the man is the image of God by himself, or that the woman is the image of God by herself, but rather that only together as a many are they together the image of God. And when we read about male and female here, what's very interesting is that the Hebrew words there are not your usual words for male and female. In the normal Hebrew, you're going to have ish as man and isha as female. But here you have zakar as male and nechiva as female. Very important. Zakar really means to remember. And nekiva, also used for female, means to be inscribed in, a hollowing out. So I want you to think about the way they wrote in ancient times, especially in ancient Mesopotamia and Sumeria. They used clay tablets and they used pieces of pen. And what they would do is inscribe what they wanted to remember on these tablets with protrusions that would then make hollows and inscriptions. And so if I want to remember, I recite. But I recite from what I've recorded. And by recording it, I help myself remember. And by reading it, I then recite. And you see the cycle there, don't you? That writing and recording create each other and complement each other. Just like if you're in a class, you're going to take notes, aren't you? Why are you taking notes? To remember. So that the image of God is not so much this visual thing, but actually a retelling. The human being is a story that tells the story of God. Human beings are the remembrance of God. They're the signature of God on his creation. Isn't that amazing? And so what we see is this difference makes a difference. And this difference comes together and complements each other to create. Because the next thing that we're told is that humans are to rule. And that part of the image is that just like God rules, human beings will rule over creation. What does that mean? Well, again, not the normal Hebrew word is used here. The word that's used is the word which means literally to tread over, as in stamping out grapes to make wine. And so what you have here is an idea of transformation. It's also used for kneading dough. When you take dough and you make bread, you have to knead it and mix the ingredients that are separate so that they come together into something new. You take those grapes and you crush them and you make them into something new, something that's wonderful and divine, that has spirit in it, wine. And thus, what you have here is what matches the rest of the creation story. God takes this barren and desolate thing called the deep that is barren and void, and he creates something new. And then when he makes human beings in his image, this many come together and complement each other to create and transform nature into something new. That is the image of God. So what do we see here? We see that what really occurs in the image is that a many become one to create something new, something brilliant, something masterful, just like God. Our differences, therefore, make a difference, don't they? But the next question we have to ask is, in what way do they make a difference? In what way are we to complement each other to become the image of God. And if we turn to just the next chapter in Genesis, we see the answer to that. There we have the creation of Adam and Eve said in another way. And here we're going to look at Genesis chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 18 and verses 24 and 25. There we read, "Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone.'" This is significant because if you read the whole of the Genesis story up until this point, you will see that every point that God creates, he says, that's good, that's good. And then when he creates human beings, he says, it's exceedingly good, it's infinitely good. But here we have a different story, don't we? It's saying actually that it's not good for man to be alone. And so thus the idea here is something's missing. Something's not quite right. And then God has the solution. This is what he says. "I will make him a helper suitable for him." Now, actually, that is a terrible translation because it has this idea, helper, that what he creates is this little assistant that's a little lower than him and that then somehow is going to help man out, like a secretary. But the Hebrew has a very different sense to it. The Hebrew is ezer kenegdo. And ezer is the word that is used to be as translated as helper. But it's better translated as savior or one who comes to the aid of. Because it's only used of two people in the Bible, ezer. It's used of God. In every other place that it's mentioned, it's used of God as God is my helper. God is the one who comes to my aid and saves me in my distress, who lifts me up in my weakness. He is my ezer. If you remember the famous passage in Psalm 139 where it says, "I look to the hills, from whence does my help come?" It's that word, ezer, ezri. And then it's used of Eve. Eve is the ezer, is the one that will come to the aid of the incomplete Adam to complete him. And we know it's complete because the word kenegdo literally means that which is equal and opposite to the man. One who stands against him as that which is his image, but in the negative, in the opposite. So what you have here is the picture actually of a puzzle, okay? Think of a puzzle piece like one that I have in my pocket here. When you look at this piece of the puzzle, isn't it the part of an image? Yeah. Can anybody guess what that image is? I hope all of you are like online typing in what you can see here. I won't tell you what it is, but it's incomplete, obviously, isn't it? This is the human being alone, without partners, without fellow humans. How does this get completed? Well, obviously by something that's not the same. There has to be something that goes in that little spot there, which means where this sinks in as a whole, something that completes it has to protrude. Where this sticks out, that which completes it has to go in. It has to have its equal and opposing opposite, doesn't it, to complete the picture. This is the image of God. You and I are images of God, not because we completely picture God, but because each of us are necessary pieces in the puzzle that once completed tells God's story. And so that tells us what makes us important, doesn't it? Let me show you. Let's go over to the rest of this puzzle. I love this puzzle. And if you look at this puzzle, what you see is, in order for this puzzle to work, every piece has to be different, doesn't it? And if you are left out of this puzzle is incomplete. If this piece is left out of this puzzle, the puzzle is complete. What makes us equal is that each of us are equally essential for completing the picture of God in this world. Therefore, each of us are essential not because we're the same, but because we're different. And it is because we are different that we can make up for each other's weaknesses. It is because you and I are different that we can come together and connect to each other to create something that's infinitely greater than any of us alone. Now that passage ends in a very interesting way. It ends by talking about the fact that the man and the woman, the zakar and the nekivah, the pen and the paper, were naked and not ashamed, not humbled, not humiliated. Why? Well, let's take a look again. Look at this puzzle. We take a piece out and we see that it's got weaknesses now. It's got incompletenesses, doesn't it? That's its nakedness. Its very part that together forms strength is a weakness apart. But when they come together, those connect, and each of the weaknesses connect and make up for each other to cause the strength. The word for naked in the Hebrew is the word arom. And arom is also the same word that's used for the snake, the serpent, who will come and break this unity up. He is called arom because what does he do? He takes that nakedness, that difference, that conflict, and he comes to it and he exploits the nakedness, doesn't he? So what do we see here? We see that difference is the same, but what makes difference strength can also make it weakness. When difference is added with love, then it becomes the image of God, the image of Christ in the world. But when image is added to jealousy and difference is added to jealousy and hatred, when you have difference plus conflict, then what you get is inequality and oppression and taking advantage of nakedness and taking advantage of weakness. And that, my friend, my brother, my sister, is the situation we're in today, isn't it? We are like a city on a hill. One of my favorite songs is a song called The City on the Hill, written by Casting Crowns. And I want to read to you the lyrics of that song. I think it describes very well the situation that we have just talked about. Did you hear of the city on the hill? Said one old man to the other. It once shined bright, and it would be shining still, but they all started turning on each other. You see, the poets thought the dancers were shallow, and the soldiers thought the poets were weak, and the elders saw the young ones as foolish, and the rich man never heard the poor man speak. But one by one they ran away, with their made-up minds to leave it all behind, and the light began to fade in the city on the hill. Each one thought they knew better, but they were different by design. Instead of standing strong together, they let their differences divide. And one by one they ran away, with their made-up minds to leave it all behind. And the light began to fade in the city on the hill. And the world is searching still, isn't it? For it was the rhythm of the dancers that gave the poets life. It was the spirit of the young ones. It was the spirit of the poets that gave the soldiers strength to fight. It was the fire of the young ones. It was the wisdom of the old. It was the story of the poor man that needed to be told. But one by one, will we run away? With our made-up minds to leave it all behind? Are we going to let the light begin to fade on our city on the hill? See, this is how Jesus describes the Christian community. We are salt and light. We are that city on the hill. And the question is, what makes that light burn so bright? Isn't it the complementary differences that, when coming together, form the image of the light of the world, the image of the very Savior of mankind, Jesus Christ? But that same difference, when coupled with hate and jealousy and competition, will turn into a fire, won't it? A fire that won't burn bright to shine the light of the world, but rather burn that city down. So, we have a choice about difference, don't we? We can either be different apart, or we can be different together.
Oh, I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard the tender whisper of love in the dead of night. You tell that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. Oh, I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but we're all searching for answers. Only you provide, you know, just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Sing it again. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Oh, love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Oh, peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call. Deeper still as you call. Deeper still as you call. Deeper still into love. Love, love. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. walking around these walls. Yes, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me yet. Waiting for change to come, knowing the battle's won, for you have never failed me yet. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never failed me yet. Yes, I know the night won't last, 'cause your word will come to pass. My heart will sing your praise again. 'Cause Jesus, you're still enough. Keep me within your love. My heart will sing your praise again. Promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never fail. Promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never fail me yet. I've seen you move, I've seen you move, you move mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way where there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. Seen you move mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way where there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. Yeah, yeah. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never fail. Promise still stands, great is your